We're going to take this one here from Megan in Buffalo. Megan writes, it's become quite popular in the last few years for people to post police body cam videos of people committing crimes or getting arrested. And it never occurred to me until now that there might be a problem with watching these videos for entertainment. Canon, could it be sinful to allow oneself to be entertained by these videos when there is no greater purpose to it? And one is just simply enjoying watching other people commit crimes, often grave sins, and all the consequences they face as a result of committing these sins. What do you think about this question, Canon?
I think you're right to listen attentively to the voice of your conscience. In this instance, that one of the fallacies of our contemporary culture, especially here in the United States, the great advancements of technology, there's so much information that's readily at our disposal. And I recently gave a talk to our young adults on AI, and I was having a wonderful discussion with a young engineer who's working in the AI field. These many platforms, they understand something that we ourselves often don't understand, and they manipulate. And what is that they understand? We said earlier in the show, as we remind ourselves often, or should, I'm made to know, love, and serve God in this life, be happy with him forever in the next. What that means, as St. Augustine says, is that my mind and my heart are open to the infinite. I'm capable of God. And so specifically with reference to your question, what that means is my mind is open to infinite knowledge. That there is a thirst and hunger in me for knowledge and love that will never be fulfilled by any creature. And so the sin in this regard, as St. Thomas Aquinas explains, is a sin of curiosity. It's a lack of temperance in my desire to know. I want to know things beyond what is reasonable for me to know. And is it necessary for me to know all the details of the sins of my neighbor? Absolutely not. We'd be ashamed, to pry into the private lives of individuals. And yet we very often do carelessly on news websites that reveal, all the sultry details of affairs, etc., or financial improprieties or what have you. We don't pay it any second thought. And I think you're absolutely right, Megan, to feel your conscience pricked by this, as I myself, I feel convicted even in you asking it, because what do these platforms understand? They understand that our thirst for knowledge is really infinite. If as I think almost anyone who's engaged with technology has experienced, even passing away, the horrible phenomenon of doom scrolling. Thanks be to God, the directory of my community prevents me from having a social media account. But I know as a confessor, have experienced it as a young man in the world, you could scroll for hours on end and never reach satisfaction on the information that you're consuming. Why is that? Because once again, our minds are made for God. There's no amount of knowledge that's going to fulfill me in a way that's lasting. And they know that, and they pique our curiosity. These various websites and sources of entertainment. That being said, is it absolutely wrong, to watch a show like I remember my father and I, we were true crime buffs, and we'd watch shows like Cops growing up, and watching law enforcement execute their duties, efficiently, etc. And there's certainly entertainment value to that. Is it absolutely wrong to watch a show like that? Not necessarily, but I think you could use a rule of thumb. Like we talked about earlier in the show, is it becoming an occupation? We should always use a great deal of discretion and circumspection, that things that depict, certainly offenses against purity or, grave offenses against charity, the former we should always exclude, certainly. And we should be very hesitant to watch the latter often, because as I like to say often, that if you were to eat a Big Mac every day, like the President of the United States, it's going to affect your body. Well, the food that we eat spiritually is the same way. The media that I consume has an effect on my soul. The music I listen to, the conversations I have, the company I keep, the videos I watch, they're all going to have an impact on the life of the spirit. They're going to change the things I think about. They're going to change the imagination, the images that are presented to me, even in a moment of prayer. They're going to change the things I dream about, even. More importantly, they're going to change the things I desire. The things I want to spend time with. And so we need to be very careful about what we're letting into the windows of our soul. What is the air that I'm breathing metaphorically? What is the food that I'm eating metaphorically in that regard? And so I think, Megan, you should view this inspiration of your conscience as an indication it's time to pull back. That I think we should always use of these things very sparingly. I think I think it's easier to trust a show like Cops, for example, because there's already a great deal of filtering and advice from law enforcement officials themselves about what might be edifying and appropriate for individuals to see. But even then, we should be a little guarded. I think it's a good idea to steer clear of these kinds of videos on social media, because once again, there's zero filter. It's just shock value. I'm well aware of accounts on X and YouTube. Their entire reason for being is just to show you shocking things, to grab your attention, and to lock you into the servitude of that kind of information, which in no way, shape, or form edifies us. So it's a great question, Megan. Grateful for the opportunity to speak on this subject. And once again, I'd say listen to the voice of your conscience in that instance.